Mr. Commissioner, I'm going to carry on with page 2 and 3 of Exhibit 1086. And, whoops, we only have one witness. Actually, my first questions are of Dr. Rempel, so I guess he should hear it.
Well, I think in the interest of time, if the questions are directed to Ms. Rempel, or Dr. Rempel, excuse me, I think that would be fine.
All right, I'll proceed. And I realized, Mr. Commissioner, that I jumped in on the bottom page of that executive summary, and I want to just take you back before just to get a context. Dr. Rempel, in the bullets above on the first part of the executive summary, Dr. Church lists a number of lessons learned from the work that's being done in 2004 to 2009. And having reviewed them on behalf of my client, I would summarize them as the following, and I wonder if you'd agree with that. You have read that list. All right, and so I would summarize that if we're going to do gravel removal in the gravel bed reach of the Lower Fraser, it needs to be properly executed, it needs to be properly planned, and it needs to be properly monitored, knowing that we still need some baseline information. Those are sort of key overarching approaches that one could summarize those bullets. Would you agree with me on that? So properly planned, you know, the first couple he's talking about the methods that are used, and so we got to be clear about the methods, or properly executed, sorry, properly planned are all the different, the following things, especially as it relates to the effective environmental monitoring of fish and invertebrate organisms that need to occur, and then the monitoring that needs to be done.
I'd agree with that. If I can add just one brief caveat. Dr. Church, being an academic, he's in a position where he's able to make these recommendations without also reconciling the potential urgency to carry on with this program, and that's outside of DFO's mandate. It's also outside of Dr. Church's mandate, but it being a provincial program under the guise of flood protection, DFO may still be in a position where we have to consider the program without those things in place if the province tells us that it's of a public safety nature with urgency.
But DFO, of course, is in a position to suggest to the province, and in fact even require the province do certain things in order for them to continue with the program.
As much as they relate to potential impacts to fish and fish habitat.
Yes, great. Okay, and so I took you this morning to some of the data and work that he summarizes at the bottom of page 2. Now I'd like to take you over to page 3. And as I read this report, what Dr. Church is suggesting is that given the variability in the environment, you know, the natural variability in the environment, and given what we know and what needs to be done, he's recommending that a 10-year plan as a minimum, a long-term 10-year plan as I read it, is the appropriate approach to be doing gravel removal in this area. And then on page 3, he lists components of those plans. Would you agree with that summary so far?
Yep.
All right, and do you agree that a 10-year plan for removal might be a better way of addressing the sort of cumulative impacts and the larger scale monitoring that we need to do?
Yeah, I think I certainly favor the approach of planning over a longer term period, and I think what DFO would still want to see in place if we put a longer term planning horizon on this program is that we would still have on an annual basis the ability to review incoming new information and new proposals for removal, because as you've articulated, it's a very dynamic environment, so plans that may be in place 8 or 9 or 10 years out may no longer be appropriate based on natural changes in the river or new information that would come to bear about the ecosystem. We still want to have the ability to modify that program given whatever new information might come out.
And given that, let's just start with the two at the bottom then, because I think that's exactly what Dr. Church is saying when it needs to be adaptive and precautionary. So taking into consideration the information as it comes and adapting as we go along. And then secondly, at the last bullet, he suggests that if you do need to do special removals for particular purposes, obviously flood control, that those proceed if they're properly monitored, but they be part of the overall volume removed for the purposes of the program.
Yeah, I agree that that total volume still needs to be really the cap on the program.
All right, so those are the last two. I just want to take you to a couple. The Commission Council took you to the second to the top. The first one is the longer-term plan, and the third one you've now agreed that a 10-year period is a reasonable horizon for planning this. That's correct?
Yeah, correct.
And then we go to the fourth bullet then, sediment removal should be focused in those sub-reaches where chronic sediment accumulation occurs, and you can identify 4 right now, but that would need to be clearly watched.
Right, correct.
You agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Maybe the easiest way is for you just to briefly review the next 4 bullets and see whether or not you agree with all of those also.
I agree with all of them. I know that the sediment budget itself, which provides us with this 230,000 cubic meters per year recruitment estimate, I know that is a moving target. The sediment budget exercise is conceptually simple, but depends on information that's very difficult to get, and that the error bounds around that 230 estimate are fairly generous. And I have spoken with Dr. Church as recently as a week ago, where he's provided me with, and some of my DFO colleagues, with information that he has some level of, not discomfort, but that he appreciates there's some level of, there's uncertainties and factors around that 230 volume that still need to be reconciled. And so I guess my point being that this volume target I would want to see as an adaptable target based on the best available sediment budget information. And so that 230 number itself might change over the 10-year planning horizon.
All right, and that would be something the technical committee would have their eye to.
Correct.
All right. Now, in the time remaining for me, I just want to turn to that technical committee and the work of your technical committee. And so I want to go to Exhibit 1078. Dr. Rempel, I noticed that there are no First Nations representatives or appointees on that technical committee, and I'm wondering if you could comment on that, in particular the value of having a First Nations representative on that technical committee to review the information that's coming forward, review something like a 10-year plan for this, and provide input both as it relates to local ecological knowledge and overall concerns and interests as it relates to these types of plans.
I think on some level, First Nations input within the technical committee could be valuable. The technical committee deals with a lot of issues, and not all of them would pertain to fish and fish habitat, and so DFO itself engages to a greater or lesser degree on issues depending on how they pertain to our mandate. And so I'm not sure in all aspects of the program if First Nations representation would contribute value at that technical level, but I can see in circumstances, yes, and also at the management level, perhaps.
All right, and then just on that front, who is it? Is it you or Jason Wong that determines which First Nations you are going to engage with as it relates to the possible implications of gravel removal? DFO tries to, I guess, cast as broad cast as broadly as possible a request for input and information as they pertain to gravel removal proposals, but the bulk of the consultation with First Nations is done by the proponent, and they take the lead on that. They carry on consultation throughout the year, and so we look for information and we request information from as many First Nations communities as identify themselves as having an interest, regardless of where necessarily they lay territorial claim. But
we do defer, or we look to the proponent to be the lead on engaging First Nations.
All right, I'm going to just thank you for that, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail with the next panel on the management aspects about this. But I was just curious, at the technical level, who is it that you consult with? Who decides which First Nations you're going to consult? Do you do that yourself, or does Jason do that, or who does it?
Within DFO, it's I think a joint decision.
All right, so you've been involved in deciding which First Nations will be engaged with as it relates to gravel removal?
Well, as I say, we look to the proponent as to assist us in carrying on that engagement throughout the year. And
even as it relates to fish and fisheries habitat issues?
No, in that case, DFO certainly takes the lead, and we've identified as best we can the various First Nations groups that might have an interest in this program, and they extend far beyond the localized gravel reach area. But we're not at all exclusive in when we're seeking information or input from First Nations on this program.
Are you aware of as to when DFO began to engage Chehalis First Nation as it relates to gravel removal in this area?
I'm not aware of when that would have began, because I inherited this file only a few years ago from colleagues, so I'm not sure when it began.
All right.
I'm sorry.
I think in the interest of time, I need to sit down now, but I'm wondering, Dr. Rosenow, if you have anything to add to any of the questions and answers that I've asked of Dr. Rempel.
Yeah, I guess the one point going back to the Dr. Church report relates to the volume, which 230,000, which the agencies have basically, in my opinion, taken as an upset. So in other words, they'll try and get that target. And that goes back to the fact that, in my opinion, it largely is not a gravel, or is not a flood protection initiative, but it is more a gravel removal initiative for aggregate. And so in that context, to me, the key issue here should be the hydraulic profile. And certainly, given what I've seen on other committees, hydraulic engineers will often leave gravel piling up in areas where there's lots of freeboard, or gravel accumulations do not reduce the freeboard, so the flood profile is not increased as a function of the sedimentation. In other words, the river between dikes is so wide at a particular location, you can actually store gravel in there, and the flood levels won't increase. So I would argue that the floodplain engineers, the dike engineers, should not have to take gravel out at locations where flood profiles will not be increased, or not increasing, or never will be increased, given this volume, which is, in terms of the big picture, is a relatively small volume vis-a-vis from Laidlaw to Mission.
There seemed to be a little bit of confusion this morning about fidelity of salmon to certain areas. As I understand it, the evidence is that the river sockeye aren't as loyal to certain areas, and that they're quite adaptive. Is that the common understanding between the two of you?
Well, I would say that if somebody can show me that, I'd like to see the evidence for it. My personal opinion is I don't think we know.
I think, in part, we don't for sure know, but the genetic evidence the genetic makeup of these river-type sockeye suggests that they are highly more differentiated than lake-type sockeye, which would infer that there's more genetic variability within the river-type sockeye group, implying a less of a fidelity, more of an adaptive strategy in that.
And is there any evidence as it relates to the fidelity of the sockeye that seem to be used in the Tramier area?
Well, I've got tissue samples. We haven't taken them to the Pacific Salmon Commission, but the understanding is we give them to the Commission, and they do the genetic analysis for us.
And Dr. Rempel, do you have anything to add about fidelity in the Tramier area?
What's been passed on to, I can't speak firsthand, but passed on to me from DFO staff with expertise in this, is that there's no reason to believe there's a fidelity to Tramner Bar, that they're opportunistic and they're making a protracted downstream migration and opportunistically using slack water habitats over a period of days to weeks to months as they move from their spawning grounds to the estuary and out to ocean.
Thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Nicole Chavez for Chiam and Stolo Tribal Council. I just have a follow-up question, and it's actually a clarification regarding the genetic difference. Now, the 5 sockeye salmon samples that Dr. Rosenau, you talked earlier that you had identified by the Pacific Salmon Commission were actually ID'd as specific populations, correct?
No, I haven't given the tissue samples to the commission yet. They would still have to run the DNA analysis. They're sitting in my freezer. I haven't gotten around to it yet.
Okay, but the others that you did have ID'd in the course of your other study, they were identified as specific from specific groups, right?
That's correct. The ones from my students up at Hope, the tissue samples were given to Greg Latham and Steve Latham with the Salmon Commission, and he's the one that relayed back to me that the predominance of those samples were Lake Stewart and Stalaco.
And Dr. Rempel, that's what you would refer to as strays from other populations, right? As set out in the memo.
Thank you. I'm not sure if strays would be necessarily the right word. It would depend on so many things, because these fish may be moving on it. They may be making their downstream migration from these natal spawning grounds to the estuary, and given the accessibility to the habitats that were sampled by Dr. Rosenau's students, they moved into those habitats to take a rest, and that's when they were caught, or perhaps. And then were trapped with water levels dropping, and they ended up being trapped in there, or they may have strayed from those populations. It's just impossible to know with any certainty what those fish were doing there, whether they were particularly honing in on that habitat or got trapped there as they were intending to make their way down. We just don't know.
If I can just clarify, the DNA samples were done 2 years running, and the same results were for both years, predominance of Stalaco and Lake Stewart.
And just a follow-up question. My friend has covered most of the points when you spoke about the technical and management committee. Now, when it comes to the decision-making process at the technical committee level, you do not take into account indigenous knowledge about the area, about fish habitat or fishing sites.
We take that information into account through through the SIA environmental assessment screening. That DFO is normally the lead agency that carries that out. Transport Canada is often involved. Environment Canada is often involved, and in the process of carrying out this environmental assessment, that's the legislated process by which we invite and expect.
But again, you don't have a member on the technical committee that you could interact with regarding that information. For example, a member from Indigenous peoples from the Gravel Reach, and you would potentially consider that a positive factor to have access to that when it comes to the technical committee processes.
DFO certainly sees the positive of that and requires that by process in conducting our screening.
Now, when it comes to impacts on sockeye salmon habitat throughout the Fraser River watershed, you'd agree with me that there are numerous impacts, including increased erosion upriver, for example, from increased logging, especially with the mountain pine beetle epidemic, right?
Yeah, that's outside my expertise.
But one of the results is increased accumulation and aggregation of sediment in the lower Fraser, especially in the Gravel Reach.
It's a possibility.
Now, in your thesis, Dr. Rempel, you talk about habitat classification, and you get down to the level of habitat units, correct?
Correct.
And while there's, due to the very small number of sockeye salmon actually encountered in the Gravel Reach, isn't that much information, but there's an indication that open nooks, channel nooks are what are favorable habitat units, right?
Yeah, it's actually channel nooks and bays, if you follow the classification I propose in my thesis, and entirely all of the sockeye salmon that I caught over my 3 years, that's over 200 sockeye, were found in either channel nooks or bays. And bays effectively are a large channel nook, and they are both slack water habitats, and that's entirely where all of the sockeye I caught were found, and that's consistent with the sampling that Dr. Rosenau has done, I believe.
You also note, and basically when we are dealing with the vast majority of sockeye in the gravel reach is really just in the gravel reach for brief periods of time, correct?
Brief, is I guess a relative term. They're in there for up to a year of their life cycle.
Sure, but also the ones that are just migrating either downstream or upstream. For example, one of the things that the returning salmon will rely on is eddies, back eddies, where they can rest in their migration up. In your thesis, one of the things that you talk about is that you see fish species also having you expect fish species to also have alternative strategies in response to seasonal flooding in the Fraser River, so using channels more, etc., right?
Right. Yeah.
Now, the other conclusion specific to your research that you found when you were working on the Harrison Bar, which was an area where there was active gravel extraction, right?
Correct.
What you found is that the availability of ecologically significant habitat types, such as open nooks, which have the highest density of juvenile fish, increased, right?
In that case, that's not always a consistent finding from every gravel removal, but in that case.
In that case, and so prior to the gravel removal, the bar surface was expansive, flat, open area, right?
At Harrison Bar it was.
Yeah, and then after the gravel removal, what happened is there was actually more availability of ecologically significant habitat. So it was more diverse, right?
At Harrison Bar, that was the case, that it became topographically more complex. There still is the other side of that, in that we had an overall lowering of bar elevation, and so we had an overall loss of habitat at high flows, shallow habitat at high flows.
But at low flows, which is oftentimes when the fish are migrating through too, you're actually having some increased diversity in habitat, right?
Yeah, at moderate.
And if gravel removal is conducted to best standards and well engineered, then you can actually creating such additional habitat features, right?
To the best that we can within the constraints of the design, which is primarily intended to achieve a hydraulic benefit, DFO tries to add those mitigating features into a removal.
And so from the perspective of a fish, small and more diverse habitat units that thereby can be created offer a wider choice in the range of habitat conditions available and support a greater number of species, right?
Yeah, that's the idea, that the greater the complexity of the habitat, the wider range of different species with different habitat uses that habitat can support.
And so in that context, when it comes, that also applies to sockeye salmon, and if gravel removal actually accomplishes that, that can be a positive, right?
Right, well, we're learning that, it appears from the data that the sockeye, these juveniles, are honing in on these particular channel nook and bay habitats, and so we would take that information to, when it came time to reviewing a removal proposal, to ensure that these proposals don't in any way impact upon existing bays and channel nooks, and to the best that we can, we might require that the design incorporate more of those features.
So from a management perspective, when dealing with gravel removal and sockeye salmon, you're confident that this can actually be addressed by identifying habitats of importance to sockeye and designing gravel removal to avoid impacts on certain habitats and also potentially creating additional habitats.
I think that might be going a bit far. I'm not sure we're confident in that, because there still is a lot of uncertainty around the specific habitat preferences of all life stages of all species. We recognize that gravel mining changes the habitat. It lowers the bar surface elevation in the location the removal takes place. So we just by the fact that we require a monitoring program and we have a compensation clause built into our authorizations, we're acknowledging the likelihood that there is some impact and temporary loss of habitat, but we are uncertain about the magnitude and duration, and that's why the monitoring is in place.
At the same time, there's also the possibility of positive impacts, for example, with additional habitats being created, especially at low flow when a lot of the migration occurs. Right?
Yeah, at certain flow levels there may be positives.
So, and just as a concluding question, you have actually no empirical evidence to show negative impact of gravel mining on sockeye salmon populations.
Not on sockeye salmon. No.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
If there's any re-exam expected by either by DFO.
For the record, it's Jonas Spiegelman for the Government of Canada. Can I get document number 1 on our list, please?
Mr. Commissioner, this is the policy and practice report comments that we just went through this exercise before the break on disallowing for the Conservation Coalition. So
I'm
my
seeking,
friend's going to it now.
I'm seeking to have them entered for identification, similar to my friend.
I'm just uncomfortable with this pattern because it defeats the purpose of all of the restrictions we've placed on this particular process throughout. It's not in my submission proper re-exam. He asked whatever questions he wanted to ask of the witness initially.
With respect, the Commissioner's ruling on marking the Conservation Coalition's PPR review comments opened the door to me asking for equal treatment.
And Leader Minister Chair, appearing for the Conservation Coalition, I agree with Mr. Spiegelman that I opened the door and that he's entitled to enter.
Sorry, Dr. Rempel, can you identify this document?
This is a document that myself and Jason Wong composed, and with comments on the PPR. I think it's tab 1 in the Commission's, or in Canada's submission.
Right. Well, there's been no ruling on whether these comments that are being provided on the PPRs are to be entered as exhibits and therefore form part of the body of evidence. So for this purpose, we'll simply mark it as identification purposes.
Thank you.
It'll be marked as double FFF.
Thank you, and I do hope this doesn't become the new pattern, because we're going to be back to a place we didn't want to be initially if now comments get marked at every hearing process.
I think Ms. Gardner did invite Commission Counsel and other counsel to have a discussion about this, Ms. Baker, which would probably be a prudent thing to do.
Thank you. One last question on, I wanted to give Dr. Rosenau an opportunity to comment on some of the questions that were just asked of by Ms. Chavez. Do you agree that there are, that for example, in Tramner Bar, where you've seen the sockeye on over a number of years, do you agree that the habitat has been improved by gravel mining that happened in 2009?
Yeah, thank you very much. I would take considerable exception to many of the statements that Dr. Rempel has said, as stated with respect to gravel mining providing a better set of habitat conditions vis-a-vis what was there before and what was there after. And I'm not even sure of the exact tab, but it refers to the. I took it out of the binder last night. It shows the monomorphic, the very smooth, the very homogeneous shape of the Tramner Bar proposal for 2011. It basically is. You could consider it to be a football field in shape, with a couple of ridges, 2 or 3 ridges, and a few little indentations, which would be open nooks. And I don't, again, the paper or the thesis by Ashley Perkins in 2007, I don't believe was entered, but I just relate to you anyways. If you look at her appendix, if somehow or other that can be entered as evidence, Appendix C, maps of stage-dependent change of habitat, the diversity on Tramner Bar is quite spectacular. And as she indicates, old, mature bars that have not been mined, that have not been interfered with from a human perspective, have a lot of habitat. They have a lot of habitat diversity. And her point is, as well, is that there's lots of habitat, a lot of this kind of habitat between, I believe, 2,500 cubic meters per second and 4,000 cubic meters per second. And after that, once you get into greater flows, the amount of habitat becomes less and less and less. And this is the kind of habitat that the gravel miners are targeting, the high elevation, high discharge habitats. And basically what they're doing is they're taking these very complex bar tops, channel nooks, embayments, open nooks, and they're flattening them. They're lowering them to a habitat elevation or flow elevation where, yeah, there might be a lot of habitat after a freshet or two, and you might be able to say, hey, there's more habitat here. But when habitat isn't limiting at between 2,500 QMEX and 4,000 cubic meters per second, but it is limiting at 4.5, 5, 6, 7, then I think you got a real problem. And so I think the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has, over the last few minutes, really misstated what is happening with gravel removal and the loss of, and I mean considerable loss of habitat, because again, our experience with Spring Bar is that it's a huge hole now, and that high top gravel bar habitat that would be available at spring freshets or moderate spring freshets has been obliterated.
I just would like to follow up if I can. I don't think I've in any way disagreed with Dr. Rosenau's assertion that gravel mining results in a localized reduction in the elevation of the bar top, and that translates into a reduction in the availability of shallow water habitat at very high flows. We don't know for certain that that type of habitat is limiting in the reach. Limiting would imply that the demand for that habitat exceeds the supply, and we don't know that's the case. I also need to contextualize the removal activities in this reach, and I'm not in any way condoning them, but I think perhaps the image that's being portrayed is that gravel mining is occurring on all of the bar tops, and they are all simultaneously being lowered in elevation, and that's not the case. There's at least 15 intact gravel bars along the reach, and gravel mining tends to occur at 1 or 2, sometimes as many as 3 bars in any one winter, but it's a fraction of the entire bar that is mined. Sometimes it's a very small fraction, sometimes it's a larger fraction, but at a reach scale, gravel mining is not obliterating, as Dr. Rosenau suggests, high bar habitat throughout the reach. There is always this habitat available, and I didn't in any way intend to suggest that gravel mining has a positive benefit to habitat, but we saw at Harrison Bar and what we've seen in other situations is that after a removal takes place, which typically does leave a site in a relatively homogeneous topographical state, with subsequent freshet events, we see rebuilding of habitat, we see restructuring and reconfiguration of the removal surface. And what that's telling us is that the fluvial processes of sediment transport and deposition are acting to, over some period of time, recover that habitat. And it may not be exactly the same habitat as it was before, and it may be less favorable to some species after a removal as compared to before the removal, but that we are not seeing any indication that a removal site in several freshet events after a removal is a sterile, hostile habitat that doesn't support fish. We aren't seeing that, and we can't deny those observations that it's still available habitat to certain species at certain flow levels.
Mr. Commissioner, those are the questions I have for this witness, unless there's anything arising that you'd like to cover with them.
Thank you very much, Drs. Rempel and Ossenoff, for your evidence and for attending here today and providing us with the benefit of your knowledge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next panel will be Jason Wong from Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Julia Berard-Danucci from the province. So we'll take just maybe a couple minutes for them to switch places. Mr. Wong's been already sworn as a witness in these proceedings, so it's just Ms. Berardinici that needs to be sworn.
You solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you in this hearing should be the truth, the whole truth?
Yes, I do.
Would you state your name, please?
Julia Berardinucci.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Wong has already testified, and his exhibit has been marked as Exhibit 647. So I'm not going to take time to go through his CV with him. Ms. Berardinucci, your CV is at tab 20 of the materials. I'll just have that pulled out now. You can just identify that as your CV.
Yes, it is.
I can have that marked, please.
Exhibit 1092.
Thank you. And I'll just get through some background with you, if you don't mind, and then I'll move back over to Mr. Wong, I think. Until December 2010, you were the manager for the Water Stewardship Division for Ministry of Environment, and you were the designated regional water manager under the Water Act.
That is correct.
Okay. And you started working with the Ministry of the Environment in 1998 following your MSc in Resource Management and Environmental Studies.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
You began working with the ministry in 1998?
Not the ministry, no, with the provincial government.
Oh, with the
I
provincial
started
government.
working with the Ministry of Environment in 2006. Sorry, that was the point I was
Okay,
thrown off
thank
by.
you. Thank you. And you have a master's in Resource Management and Environmental Studies.
Correct.
And then since December of 2010, you've been the district manager for Metro Vancouver Squamish, which is actually a provincial region, right?
Correct.
And you're still with the province?
I am.
Okay, and you've been responsible for, on the management committee of the Fraser gravel removal program, but you're in the process of transitioning out of that?
That is correct.
Okay. And as regional water manager, under the Water Act, you issued approvals under that act for gravel removal in the Fraser River.
That is correct.
So I'm going to actually come back over to you, Mr. Wong, and in the interest of time, I'm going to move fairly quickly through some of the questions I have for these witnesses so that they can be made available to the participants. Since, Mr. Wong, since 2009 March, you have managed the Fraser River gravel file for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And you sit on the BC Canada Management Committee to address gravel removals?
Yes.
Okay, and that, just to be clear, that is Exhibit 1078 in these proceedings marked this morning. You're the DFO chair, right?
Yeah, it's a co-chair function between myself and Julia.
Okay. And what is your role on the committee?
The DFO representative at the management committee.
Right, and what do you do in that role?
In general, we discuss the sediment removal or sediment management planning as it comes forward. I represent the DFO interests and likely path of various statutory decisions and associated assessments and things like that. And we weigh the various proposals as they come forward and try to factor in the considerations of all the respective agencies and the broader mandates that we represent.
Just to back up, you are responsible for negotiating the new long-term agreement to deal with gravel removal, is that right?
I have been. Just so it's clear, I, like Julia, I'm also transitioning out of that function, but up till now, that is me.
You haven't quite got rid of that responsibility yet?
It's a tough one to shake sometimes.
All right, if you can turn to tab 24 of the Commission's documents, letter of agreement that's being negotiated. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay, could I have that marked, please?
Exhibit 1093.
93. And you'll see at the bottom of the first page and over to the second page, there's a highlighted section, which I take it is still under discussion. Oh, doesn't appear to be highlighted for some. Oh, it must be on the third page, sorry, or third to fourth page, there. It says here, an assessment and monitoring plan being developed by DFO and Ministry of the Environment will guide the assessment and monitoring activities, which include data collection for the program. Is that still under discussion?
Yes.
And is this the involvement of Ministry of the Environment in this section? Is that referring to the biologist aspect or the habitat biologist part within Ministry of the Environment?
I would say that might be subject to different views. DFO's preference would be that that would be the most suitable in terms of getting input as it relates to the fish and fish habitat side of things. But it's been a matter of some discussion between ourselves and the other members of the management committee.
Okay, and presently there's not a habitat biologist from the province who's an official member of the technical committee, is that right?
That's correct, but there has been more recently some more direct engagement from what I would call generally habitat-oriented staff from the province on the committee, but not as official sort of standing members.
You're involved in issuing authorizations, correct?
Yes.
We've already reviewed or had marked a couple of authorizations issued by issued under the SIA this morning. And one topic that actually was just being discussed by the previous panel is gravel removal and recruitment. In your view, if gravel removal exceeds recruitment in an area, will that result in habitat loss?
Well, that's one way, and that would be probably a longer term, more long-lasting effect, but habitat loss can occur even if recruitment does match removal, even in the temporal basis until it fills back in again.
Has DFO required compensation for any habitat loss relating from gravel removal?
Not to date. Since the authorizations we issued in 2000, or for the 2010 works, we have had a provision in there to have habitat compensation subject to post-construction monitoring to assess the duration and magnitude of the negative effects that were anticipated from the works. So depending on what the outcomes of that are, and till now we're not at the point where we can conclude what the duration and magnitude of effects are. We have not yet had a compensation requirement, but we're anticipating that one will be necessary from the works that were done in 2010.
All right. Why did it take until 2010 to include a compensation feature in the permits or the authorizations?
Well, I'm speculating a bit just from looking at previous history, because I wasn't the part of the decision-making process or involved for DFO in the file, but it's my understanding that it was the rationale was that it was expected that the impacts were fairly short-lived and would be recovered in terms of natural channel movement and sediment movement. And I think based on observations over time that indicated that wasn't happening, that's why Laura and I had built that provision into the authorizations starting in 2010.
You're familiar with the 2011 SIA assessment that was done for Tramner?
Yes.
Right. Why don't I have that pulled up? It's tab 16, which is, I'm sorry, I don't have the exhibit reference written down here, but tab 16 of our binder, which looks like it might 1081. That's it. Oh, sorry, it's the province's binder. But it's exhibit 1081. 1081, okay. All right. If you could turn to page 5. This talks about the morphology and sedimentation, and I just wanted to identify where you see partway down the page where it says Appendix A in bold. Just on the left-hand side, you can see it bold. Yeah, there it is. It says in this, it talks about the amount of sediment coming into the proposed removal area as being 325,000 cubic meters since 1999, 36,000 cubic meters in a year. And then if you go down to the bottom of the following paragraph, it says the 2009 removal at Tramner Bar consisted of, explains the removal, and this is about 146 cubic meters of sediment would be removed. And the 2011 proposal is to remove 186,000 cubic meters of sediment. Doesn't that appear to be removing more than has been deposited in that area since 1999? When you combine 2009 and 2011 together?
You might have to give me a minute to read the details of this. I could probably give a shorter answer, recognizing that time's sort of pressed here. The assessments that we make are done on the basis of the annual projects that are brought forward to us from Emergency Management BC. We work actively with them as they bring them forward, trying to steer them towards things that are more likely to be viable as opposed to things that are going to have a lot of work put into them that won't be viable. And we take all the information that we have available to try to understand how does this proposed change, how is that likely to affect fish and fish habitat, both directly and specifically on that bar, as well as more broadly in terms of other channel-related processes. So the sediment budget for the reach is a consideration. The deposition patterns on that bar are a consideration. and largely by way of evaluating the work that we get from the proponents and their consultant experts, and having our staff as well as staff from the other agencies look at them, we come to a decision as to whether that proposal is likely to be reasonable given the purpose of the works and the anticipated effects.
Right, but doesn't it, if 186,000 cubic meters is proposed to be removed right on 2 years after 146,000 cubic meters was removed, that's a fairly significant amount of sediment being removed from this bar, is it not?
Well, it is, and it's my understanding, and I'd have to refresh myself on the specific details of the numbers on this file, and if you want me to take the time to do that, I can. But I would say that at the time we made the decision to authorize the works, we were comfortable that we understood as much as is possible in the context of the proposals as they came forward. The effects were not likely to be long-lasting or particularly negative in terms of a site-specific effect on that reach. So I do understand your question, but I would have to sort of take a few minutes to read the details of what the previous paragraph is referring to and perhaps check some references to give you the absolute answer to what you're asking. And I can do that if you'd like.
Well, I guess the issue is what, in terms of habitat compensation, is this the kind of bar where you would expect there would be compensation ordered after the removal was permitted?
I think for the most part, what I have seen is that most bars under our current analysis we would require some degree of compensation for, because the effects seem to last at least one freshet. There seems to be partial recovery, but unless the removals are exceptionally small, there is a footprint of that removal that persists for some time.
Right, because it says here that there's 36,000 cubic meters a year which would come in, and if you've taken 186,000 out, it's going to take a long number of years before it's recovered.
If that's what nature actually delivers, that would be correct. But it is hard to predict how it's going to work, and sometimes it's faster and sometimes it's slower than the models would suggest.
All right, thank you. I wanted to take you to another memo that was prepared by you. It's at tab 13 of the Commission documents. Do you remember why this, first of all, you prepared this memo?
Yes.
And do you remember why it was prepared?
Yeah, it was prepared and in terms of briefing director in our organization as to the current situation with regard to DFO's involvement in this file, some of the issues that we were dealing with in that moment in time, as well as looking to the near term and maybe longer term how we would engage in managing the file.
Right, and you've reviewed this memo before coming here today?
Briefly, yes.
All right. Does it still represent the sort of state of the project?
Reasonably so, although on some specific points there has been progress since the memo was written.
Which issues have progressed since the memo was written?
Sorry, I didn't note it that way. I could.
Oh. Right. Well, if you don't, could you just quickly go through the headings and see if there's anything that stands out? So I'd like to have this marked as a representative state of the project.
Exhibit 1094.
There's nothing on this page that I think warrants a particular update.
Okay. Mr. Dunn, could you turn to the next page? It should be in the binder in front of you, tab 13, if that's helpful.
Thanks, Charlie. I'd say on 5 and 6, while the status of the letter of agreement and long-term plan are still open and that we haven't got new ones in place, there has been a fair amount of work, in particular around discussing the nature of a long-term plan, and meetings as recently as this spring amongst the agencies, or a joint meeting of the Technical and Management Committee did do some work in discussing that, and there are future meetings planned to continue with that. Just want a quick scan here. That would probably be the most significant thing that I would mention in terms of an update.
Thank you. And just following up on that, tab 21 of the Commission documents has a set of minutes, draft minutes from a meeting held just in March of this year. This relates to the development of a long-term plan for gravel removal. Is that right?
Yes.
And you were at this meeting?
Yes.
Have these marked, please.
1095.
What was the intention of this meeting and this group of people?
In general, it was an assembly of the technical committee and management committee jointly to discuss making or advancing the concept of a long-term plan and trying to frame out what the scope of that would be and what the specific actions or activities would be underneath that.
Right, and you reviewed those minutes?
Yes.
And they're accurate?
There have been a number of comments to those minutes from different participants at that meeting, and they were never actually finalized, so those comments just live as different views, but they're accurate in general, yes.
Okay. Has there been any follow-up from that meeting? Has there been any further meetings, or?
Not yet. There have been, I think we've tried to schedule a follow-up twice, and for various scheduling reasons, including one important member being sick for a while, we haven't been able to do it yet, but we're still planning to.
Right. There's some data gaps that are discussed in this document, and I'll just ask you about some of them. What about gaps in monitoring? What gaps in monitoring have been identified?
Sorry, can you direct me to what you're referring to?
I'm just trying to go so fast here, I apologize. And these pages aren't numbered, but if you go to the 4th page, there, at the top it says we haven't tried to tackle, this is from Laura, which I think it was Laura Rempel, our prior witness, is that right?
Yes.
Tried to tackle reach or larger scale effects. Everything has been site scale to date. We need to know cumulative reach impacts in order to have any confidence when authorizing multi-year reach-wide permits. And then Craig, I'm not sure who that is, says there's gaps in monitoring as well. Can you identify, do you remember the discussion around that?
Right now, in general, yes. I wouldn't sort of give don't want to give an impression of a total recall here or anything, but
no.
I think that there are gaps in monitoring in terms of having a broader understanding of issues, much like what Laura and Marvin were speaking to this morning. Sockeye is one thing that there is still room to learn more about. It's not one that's been high on the radar of the technical committee or management committee, but we're still in the early learning phases of sturgeon, especially juvenile sturgeon utilization in the area. That's been an identified gap. There's ongoing work in that regard. In at least DFO's opinion, there's room for a lot more in situ monitoring as the works are undertaken, and there's a number of things like that if we're able to, DFO would like to see factored into a new management plan for how these works are undertaken.
And have any gaps been identified in the department's understanding of sockeye in the gravel reach?
Only in some limited way, and it's come largely out of submissions from the Fraser Gravel Stewardship Committee, Marvin and others, and a lot of that information was shown earlier today with the view that there is more sockeye utilization in the reach, or in particular these river types that Marvin spoke to, and that the effect may be more significant. I'm using my interpretation of the point here, and that it warrants more consideration. I would say that DFO's put its mind to that, and we don't discount it by any means, but in the scheme of the issues that we're looking at related to the gravel removal, it does not seem to be a primary one in terms of where we would focus new and additional monitoring effort at this time. And it's not to say that it's an issue that we believe we're fully up to speed on, but as it rates to other issues, it's not one that jumps out as a priority, in my opinion.
Thank you. And then the new long-term agreement, or the agreement, I guess, is being talked about for the Fraser. Will it be a long-term or a multi-year implementation of that agreement?
Well, that's still under discussion. I think from each party's view, we can see the value in that, whether we're able to structure the program and get the information assembly, the investment in monitoring and plan development, and the associated regulatory procedures lined up to enable that, I think is still unknown. But I think we can all see benefits to that in terms of both the flood risk management as well as managing the environmental potential environmental impacts from this work.
If you were to move to a multi-year plan of some kind, would that engage a different kind of review under SIA than what's done now?
More than likely. Certainly the scope of the review would change, because the review currently is scoped as the projects are brought to us. So if we had a project that was, say, a multi-year, a 10-year project or something like that, then we would scope the SIA review in that way.
And would that be a positive move, do you think, in understanding larger ecosystem impacts of gravel removal?
Yes, most certainly.
Thank you. I'd like to move now to Ms. Bartonucci. The document that shows the management structure for the gravel removal committee has already been identified, and you sit on the management committee along with Jason Wong as the other co-chair?
Correct.
Okay. If we can have that document pulled up again, I think you wanted to make some changes to the titles of all the departments because the provincial government's made some changes. So would you like to just take this time to review the changes that should be made here? And I'll just identify that these titles are reflected in the PPR, and those corrections that she will make here should be incorporated into paragraph 35 of the PPR, but I won't go to that document right now.
I'm assuming you'd just like me to focus in on the ministerial organizations as opposed to sub-regions, et cetera.
Right.
So Alec Drysdale now works for Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations. Julia Bartonucci now works for the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations. So that's the management committee. At the technical committee level, Lottie Flint-Peterson has been identified as MNRO correctly.
So those three changes?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Sorry, but just now, Forest Lands.
Oh, sorry, no, that's MNRO. That's see, even I can't get it right yet. Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations.
That replaces MNRO.
MNRO, yes.
You heard Mr. Wong describe the work done by that committee. Do you have any additional comments you'd like to add? Or
I generally agree with how he characterized it. The management committee, I would say, however, its fundamental purpose is to provide guidance to the proponent, to troubleshoot issues as they come up, and to try and streamline the process as much as possible, to seek efficiencies.
And what is your role in terms of authorizations? Earlier today, we marked a couple of provincial documents, which I should take you to. One is now marked as Exhibit 1083. That's approval application report. And then the document that goes along with it has been marked. Write down the exhibit number, sorry. Tab 15. 1084. So those have been marked already. If you could just describe what your role is in that.
My role up until a few months ago was as regional water manager to consider applications for works in and around the stream under the Water Act, and to make decisions accordingly, which in this case are called approvals under the Provincial Water Act.
Okay, and what materials do you or a person sitting in that role look at when making the decisions on the approval applications?
A number of documents. The key or first document that one starts with is the water technical report provided by staff, which is a summative document of which characterizes what's been applied for, and also summarizes all comments received from referrals.
Is that, sorry to interrupt, is that the same as 1083, if that can just be put up?
It is.
Okay, sorry, carry on.
I was talking about referrals, wasn't I? Sorry, First Nations are contacted through the referral process, and other agencies which have mandates associated with the application, as well as local governments. And it then concludes with a recommendation on whether or not to grant an approval or to refuse an approval.
Okay. And once that if a recommendation has been made to not approve, what happens?
Then the decision maker needs to decide whether they're going to follow that recommendation or not.
And who is the decision maker? That would be you sitting in that role?
In this case, it has been me, yes. Yeah, the power under the Water Act lies both for approvals with the Assistant Regional Water Manager and the Regional Water Manager.
All right. Are there other additional materials referred to by you as that decision maker in that role, in addition to the technical report, or in this case it's called an approval application report?
Yes, certainly. You try and refer to whatever you need in order to come to a pointed decision. In this program, what's been customary is for the draft CS screening report to be shared and reviewed, and that's a reciprocal action that we take with the feds, in that we share our draft water technical report as well, information, and then any other studies or information presentations that one feels is necessary in order to assist with coming to a decision. Most times the focus is on and the documents referred to are summarized, and the basis for decision are summarized in the water technical report.
In the commission binder, tab 16, I think it is, there's an application document similar to what we've just been looking at for 2009 at Tramner.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
You remember this one?
I do.
I'll have this one marked, please.
1096.
All right, and then the approval that was issued, I think, is at tab 5 in the BC documents. I apologize for flipping between binders here. In the provincial documents, tab 5. That's it. So that's the approval that was issued?
Yes, I reckon. Well, that's a cover letter to an approval.
I'm sorry, if you could move down the page, Mr. Lund, to the next page. There.
There we go. Yes.
Okay, I'll have that document marked as the next document.
1097.
And then you mentioned that a decision would be made, and I take it that is a decision in writing, and we can see a decision for this approval as in tab 6 of the BC documents. So that would be an instance where the underlying report had not recommended that removal be allowed at Tramner and you had to issue a decision that then allowed that approval to be made.
A reason for decision document would be written in any instance where a decision maker feels they need to provide additional information further to the technical report to explain what decision they're making, regardless of whether it's in support of, in keeping with the recommendation or in opposition to the recommendation. More often than not, it's written in cases where a decision is made contrary to what's recommended by the staff in the water technical report.
Right, and in your decision is fully set out in this document? Your
Yes,
reasons
it
for
is.
decision. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm not going to take you to it. It speaks for itself. I do want to take you, though, to the report from...
You were said
Oh,
last
sorry, that
document.
should be... Yes, I'm sorry, we probably have a bunch to mark here, don't we? Is it just this one that I have marked?
Just tab 6.
Okay, yes, please mark that.
That's 1098.
I do want to take you to Dr. Church's report, which is already marked today, and that's exhibit number 1086.
Could I ask you for the tab, please?
It's in the Commission's documents, tab 14.
Thank you kindly.
All right, so you are familiar with this report?
Very.
Okay, and we heard from Ms. Rempel that this was prepared at the request of the Emergency Management BC?
Correct.
Okay, and there's a letter that goes with it, which is tab 15, and it's exhibit 1085. If that could just be popped up. There you go. All right, and we heard from Dr. Rempel that this letter wasn't provided at the time the report was provided to the committee. Was that, is that true also for your receipt of the cover letter? Did you get it at the time the report was prepared, or did you get it at a later date?
I received it at a later date. It was early this year.
Okay, and how did you come to get it?
I was provided a copy of it through Emergency Management BC. And Griffin sent it to me by email.
Okay. And just to confirm, Dr. Rempel said, going to the report, which is 1086, we looked at the executive summary of this report, page 2, and she identified that when you look at the two strategies that have numbers there on the executive summary, that profile maintenance had been adopted for gravel removal in the Fraser. Do you agree with that?
I would say it hadn't been formally adopted per se and made that clear, but I have been working under that principle in my decision making since I started making decisions under the Water Act on the approvals for this program.
Okay.
And that was that profile maintenance describes my understanding of the program.
All right, thank you. And we talked with Mr. Wong about a meeting that was held on March 14, 2001, and you were at that meeting as well?
Yes, I was.
Right, and do you have anything to add to the comments that Mr. Wong made about the purpose of that meeting?
No, other than there are, when I read through the draft meeting notes, I would say it captured the gist of the conversation. There are a few inaccuracies that I feel still need to be corrected in the final meeting minutes. But it was very much an open, free-flowing conversation, trying to scope in all aspects to be considered further as we move through further discussions on the long-term plan.
All right, and do you agree with his statements as to where the planning process is now in terms of moving on with further meetings and discussions?
Yes, actually there's a joint technical and management committee meeting scheduled for end of July at this point in time, and with the invitation to Dr. Church to join us and discuss this in further detail. So we are moving along. Unfortunately, a flood got in the way, and many of the staff that are involved here have had to work on other things, so we've had delays.
Jonas Spiegelman for the Government of Canada. In the interest of time, I'm going to just ask a couple of my questions and hope to be very short. So, Mr. Wong, when you were here giving some evidence on April 4th and 5th on habitat management generally, you spoke of some jurisdictional challenges that the habitat management program faces and the need to maintain a collaborative and cooperative working relationship with the province of BC. Do you remember giving that evidence?
Yes.
In your assessment, is the gravel removal file an example of that?
It's an example of the federal and provincial government sort of cooperating on a planning scale. I wouldn't put it forward as necessarily a perfect model, but it's one that's better than not cooperating.
Thank you. And can you just provide a few brief comments on how DFO approaches the Fraser River Sediment Management Program generally?
Certainly. And I think this is an important point that I know a number of people take exception to, but it is important to emphasize the DFO's perspective on this file, and that is that it comes to us from the Government of British Columbia, from the agency with responsibility for public safety, and within that umbrella, flood management and risk management. So we get that, again, from a senior level of government as a public safety priority when we get these sediment removal requests. So DFO takes them very seriously. And to a degree, we evaluate those somewhat differently than we would a project that was strictly an economic development project, because the public safety factor weighs quite heavily in terms of the rationale and the compelling circumstance for the proposed works. So, if it was strictly an economic development proposal, the consequence of DFO rejecting a proposal because it had a significant habitat impact would be strictly an economic cost to the proponent of that. But in this case, if DFO were to reject a project that came forward, our understanding is that that would come with increased risk to public safety. So that puts a fairly significant emphasis on these projects, much different than a typical development referral that we would receive.
And can you just discuss a few of the mitigation measures that DFO requires of the proponent when considering authorizing these works?
Sure. Some of the more significant ones are ensuring that any sediment removal works are set back a significant distance from known areas where pink salmon spawn. That is probably the most significant sensitive habitat utilization that we know for sure happens in the proximity of these removals. And so, for instance, in 2010, when the removals happened, there was a very deliberate mapping by the consultants working for EMBC, and the removals were set well back from pink spawning. And the monitoring that we did during the works found, even when there was a site where the operators made a mistake and went closer to the river than the intended boundary was going to be, our follow-up indicated that there was still enough of a buffer that mistake did not result in negative harm to areas where pink salmon had spawned. So that's one example. Other things relate to the timing of the works, trying to avoid known sensitive habitats and work on areas that are thought to be somewhat more tolerant to disturbance and things like that.
And finally, in your assessment, how significant a risk to Fraser sockeye is gravel removal from the Lower Fraser?
Well, I'll provide my answer recognizing the context of the discussion that's happened this morning, and I'll just put a bit of perspective on it from what I'm bringing to this answer. In the chair I sit in for DFO, as per my time here back in April, I look at habitat issues in the Fraser watershed, basically upstream of about Boston Bar. That is the scope of management area that myself and our staff work under. And we see all kinds of issues that are very relevant and, in our opinion, fairly significant from a habitat perspective as they relate to sockeye. And I also happen to, at least currently, manage the gravel file for DFO. And in my opinion, the gravel removal work, while I do agree it's an important fish habitat issue, does not really rate in terms of significance for habitat issues as they relate to sockeye. And I compare that to things like the potential changes in watershed from mountain pine beetle to significant water use and water diversions to cumulative impacts of very, very accelerated and high rates of foreshore recreational property development and things like that. So I don't at all mean to try to trivialize this sediment removal. I think it is an important fish habitat issue. It's probably quite important to things like sturgeon, juvenile chinook, pink salmon that use that reach very directly. As far as sockeye go, it doesn't strike me as significant. And notwithstanding this information that is fairly new, and in fact some of the stuff that I heard Dr. Rosenow speak to today in terms of the stock profile information of the sockeye that his students had found, being Stalaco and early Stewart, if I heard that correctly. This would be the first time I've heard that information, and I find that interesting. And it's something that we would follow up on in terms of future considerations, but not something that strikes me as alarming in terms of the well-being of Fraser sockeye.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
For the record, with the microphone on, Cliff Prowse for the province. I think Ms. Bertolucci, I'll address most of my questions to you. Mr. Land, could we have a tab 24 of the province's documents? So this is a document that was prepared by the proponent ministry to explain the flood protection program. Are you familiar with this document?
Yes, I am.
And Mr. Lunn, if you could turn to the 4th slide. Thank you. What are the goals of the Provincial Integrated Flood Hazard Management Program?
The goal of the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Program is really the protection of public safety, people, infrastructure, and to ensure that proactive planning takes place in order to avoid disasters.
All right, and their components include emergency management, dike and dam safety, and land use management?
Correct.
And what is the role of the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations?
The role of forest lands and natural resource operations at this point in time, because I'm sorry, I'm saying that because of organizational change, is related to the regulation of dikes and dams, oversee land use planning, guidelines, local government planning and zoning, risk analysis of flood consequences, hydraulic modeling, authorizations associated with gravel removal, participating in emergency planning or assisting others and other agencies in emergency planning, and obviously information sharing.
And there's an ongoing program of sediment removal in the Lower Fraser River, and how does that relate to the provincial flood protection strategy?
Well, it's just one component of the whole larger strategy, and really the first line of defense against flooding is dikes and the maintenance of dikes, the regulation of those. and the sediment management is done or contemplated in relation to those dikes.
Mr. Lund, could we have tab 28, please? This is a letter that has to do with the governance structure in the management and technical committees. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And I note that in the end of the second paragraph, it refers to the management committee as the decision makers committee. Can you explain that to the commissioner, please?
The management committee has been comprised of decision makers associated with federal legislation and provincial legislation. Under provincial legislation, it's been the Land Act and the Water Act, and of course, federal legislation, as well as Emergency Management BC as proponent.
All right. And how does your role under the Water Act, is that a decision maker role?
Yes, it is, and I'm sorry I failed to include navigable waters on the management committee. Sorry, I'll go back. I just wanted to be inclusive.
All right. With respect to, Mr. Lund, could we have tab 27 of the provincial document? Oh, sorry, could we mark that as an exhibit?
First of all, did you wish to mark tab 24?
Yes, tab 24, sorry.
Okay, that'll be 1,099. And then tab 28, wish that marked?
Yes, please. Yes, Ms. Berardinucci, are you familiar with these two documents?
I am familiar with this document, yes,
And
on the screen now.
so, if we could look at 27, I'm sorry, Mr. Lund. So tab 27, what does that show us in terms of who's expending what?
This is a document that was produced by Emergency Management BC, to the best of my knowledge, and it's regarding infrastructure funding in relation to dikes. And, oh, sorry, it also includes the urgent flood mitigation program.
All right, and
No, sorry.
and tab 19, Mr. Lund? And tab, sorry, document 19, this shows expenditures by different levels of government, does it?
Yes, it does.
And what are those, what do those?
Again, this is an infrastructure funding program in relation to dike enhancements.
So, and it includes sediment removal as one component of what's shown on this, does it? I'm sorry.
Sorry, not on this particular page.
Right, so tab 27? To the bottom, please, Mr. Lund.
Oh, thank you. Yes, there we go. Needed the
So
scrolling
the
to take-
comparison of, can you tell the commissioner the comparison of the two totals that we see at the bottom there?
Well, the flood protection program in relation to the dikes, from what I see here, there's a total of, sorry, that's ballpark figure of 13 million. And the sediment management program is 2,500,000
Thank you.
approximately.
Could I ask that those two documents be marked as exhibits?
Tab 27 will be marked as 1101. Tab 19 will be marked as 1102.
With respect to your might we have tab 4, please, of the province's exhibits? This was the application put forward by the proponent for the 2009 gravel removal on Tramway Bar.
Yes, it is.
Might that be marked as the next exhibit, Mr. Commissioner?
1103.
And I wanted to ask you, with respect to the 2009 application, this has already been marked at Exhibit 1098, if that could be brought forward for the witness, and that's at tab 6 of the province's documents. Can you just outline for the Commissioner the basis for the decision that you made with respect to proceeding with respect to this application and in light of the concerns that have been raised in the water stewardship report?
Yes, certainly. There were two areas of concern or uncertainty that I wanted to consider in further detail. One was the hydraulic benefit of the proposed removal from Tramner Bar in 2009, and the second aspect was potential impacts of the proposed removal to fish and fish habitat. In relation to the hydraulic conveyance or the overall hydraulic benefit of what was being proposed. What was submitted by Emergency Management BC, the proponent, was rated or evaluated by a consultant that was hired by myself for the province to provide advice on what would be the benefit of that particular extraction, and it was received a relatively low rating for hydraulic benefit. Now, that was actually a second or a different or an alternate proposal than had originally been tabled, which originally had identified Tramner as a possible bar for removal. What had happened in earlier designs was that it was looked at from a fish habitat and fisheries impacts perspective and deemed to be harmful. It was a bar edge design, and so it was actually modified and then submitted for approval and consideration. And I took that aspect into consideration. And saw that, and felt that, or came to the conclusion that although it wasn't as efficient or effective a design, that it was reasonable to consider an alternate design for that site if it was in fact more protective of the environment and a better design in relation to the impacts on fish and fish habitat. So that was the decision I took on that particular aspect. With regards to impacts on fish and fish habitat, I turned to the DFO screening report and also spoke to the sturgeon specialist within the ministry to try and get a sense of what had been considered in both of those aspects. The conclusion that I read in the SIA screening report was that there was obviously going to be impacts from the Tramner Bar extraction. However, they were considered to be reparable, relatively limited in scale. Actually, 1.2% of the reach was anticipated to be impacted, and that their conclusion from a fisheries perspective in relation to federal species was that this project could proceed, or this approval could proceed. There was much more uncertainty regarding the impacts of the Tramner extraction in relation to sturgeon, and basically a lack of information resulting in a lack of ability of the specialists with the ministry to provide advice on impacts to sturgeon. To that end, I considered what would be the potential for harm in relation to the size of that particular proposal, whether or not there was irreparable damage anticipated, or what was the risk there in relation to doing nothing from a public safety perspective. And from what the conclusion I came to was that this project had some benefit from a public safety perspective in meeting the objectives of managing gravel in the Fraser in relation to the dikes, and that we had an opportunity here to actually obtain more information on the impacts on sturgeon through the issuance of the approval and requiring certain monitoring to take place as a result of further to the gravel extraction. And in this context, I made a decision that it was reasonable to move forward as long as we incorporated as many terms and conditions that we could that asked or required more information to be gathered on the impacts.
All right. And so there were various conditions to address environmental concerns as part of the approval?
Yes, there were.
And might the witness have Exhibit 1083, Mr. Lunn? So this is the 2011, and this is both the approval and the application, approval and application report.
Yes, this is what we commonly term the water technical report.
All right, and Mr. Lunn, if we could have the last page of the document. And you've signed off on the approval on this document, have you?
Yes.
And can you tell the commissioner what differences there were in the 2011 approval as opposed to the 2009 approval?
In this particular circumstance, information had been gathered regarding sturgeon by the proponent and submitted, and the sturgeon specialist for the ministry was able to provide advice and basically advised me that in their opinion the impacts, there would be impacts obviously, but they would be temporary and recoverable, and at the scale that they were being proposed, given appropriate mitigative measures, it was reasonable to proceed, or a recommendation was made that it would be reasonable to proceed with issuing an approval.
You signed off on the 2011 application?
I issued an approval, yes.
And in 2009, you told us that the original suggestion that it included some bar edge work, which might have been hydraulically preferable, but was not environmentally appropriate, and so you didn't proceed with that. You proceeded with a secondary option in 2009?
That's correct, yes.
And in 2011, was the bar edge approved? Sought or approved?
No.
And in 2011, in fact, due to other circumstances, the work did not proceed.
That's correct.
Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
I can at least start and occupy the rest of the time profitably, I would trust. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Wang. And for the record, Leadham Initial T, appearing as counsel for the Conservation Coalition. I've not had the benefit of addressing you before. My understanding from reviewing the documentation is that you are the authority on behalf of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that is responsible for sign-off on the Section 35.3 authorizations on gravel removal. Is that correct?
Yes, I signed them. The current approval process is that I will send up the authorization as drafted for approval to sign it off. I have to actually get it vetted above me, and then once that comes back, I sign it on behalf of the department.
I see. And so when you send it up the ladder, how far up the ladder do you send it? Does it go to the RDG level?
It ultimately does, yes.
All right. And I take it that you
And
signed...
all authorizations do. This one's not special. They all go there. That's our current process, just to
I
be
see.
clear.
All right. But in terms of the technical expertise, essentially, do I have it correctly that the RDG looks to you to provide that information to him? Her?
Yes.
Essentially then, do you, and I think I heard this through your evidence, you basically accept at face value the proposition that the province puts forward that the basis for gravel removal is flood control, is for public safety?
Yes.
You don't look behind that, do you? You don't actually do tests and studies yourself to determine if that is accurate or not?
Not specifically on a year-by-year basis, but over time, I think the department has a degree of comfort that there is a reasonable enough case that up to our level of expertise and knowledge has been presented that the sediment removal has some flood mitigation value, and it's reinforced by things like the report that Dr. Church wrote that it was spoken to earlier today.
Yes, and we'll get to that report in due course. Essentially, though, as I understand it, you don't get involved with hydrology and geomorphology and fluvial geology and things of that nature. That's not within your area of expertise. You rely upon others for that.
Personally, that's correct. Laura Rempel, who was here earlier, has expertise that is either direct or directly approaching some of those particular things, and she does most of the work on the authorizations and EAs and works with me to have those developed. Okay. So we get involved that way, but only insofar as it relates to fish and fish habitat, so not on the flood benefit and engineering side of things.
And I'm going to turn to you, Ms. Berardinucci, and ask you a series of questions. What happens to the gravel that's removed? Is it used to build up the dikes, or what's it used for?
It goes to different parties. The most recent extractions have been in partnership with the First Nations.
Right.
And they've been using them for community development purposes.
So it's basically used for infrastructure and for construction purposes, as far as you're aware?
I don't know in detail what it's used for.
Right. Is it a commercial venture of some sort, to your knowledge?
Not to my understanding.
Essentially, then, from the perspective of the province, you put forward the position that this is an integral part of flood control relief by the province in terms of the Fraser River. Is that correct?
It's one aspect of a multi-parameter flood hazard management program.
Yes. And I think you also gave evidence earlier to my learned friend, Mr. Prowse, that essentially you saw the dike work as being of importance levels more important than the gravel removal program. Is that fair to say?
I'd say it would be the first, yes, it's the first line of defense against the flood risk.
All right. Could we have Exhibit 1085, please? This is a letter from Dr. Church that accompanied his report, and I'll get to the report in a moment. Have both of you seen this letter?
Yes.
Yes.
And my understanding is that the letter went to Ms. Ann Griffin, who was the manager at the time for EMBC, is that right? Or one division of EMBC?
Yes.
Is she still there?
Yes, she is.
I think you gave evidence, Ms. Berardinucci, that you did not see this letter until sometime later.
Correct.
And that was because you got it in an email from Ms. Griffin's office.
Correct.
Now, have you read through the letter in detail?
I have.
And I'm going to address portions of the letter. If we look down to the paragraph beginning, however, we know from substantial experience, thank you, that individual sediment removal short of the order of 1 million cubic meters will not substantially affect local water levels in the short term. And the author goes on to say, but sediment removal on such a scale would very significantly disrupt the aquatic ecosystem. There is furthermore concern that the current program pays too little attention to the potential ecological costs of sediment removal. Are either of you in a position to comment on that particular paragraph? Do you agree or disagree with it? Mr. Wang?
I would defer to Dr. Church in terms of the 1 million cubic meters affecting local water levels, but it's my understanding that that would be correct. And in terms of the too little attention to potential ecological costs, I would agree in general, but not to say that that we're not putting our minds to that. So there's a difference, I think, between the holistic perspective that Dr. Church presents here that I'm not taking exception to. But that's not to say that we don't pay attention to them specifically on the individual sediment removal projects that are brought forward to us by the province. Yeah, could we do more? Absolutely. I wouldn't dispute that, but it's not done in a vacuum either.
And turn it to you, Ms. Berardinucci.
To add to that, yeah, I think there are reasonable comments to make. We haven't considered removals in the order of magnitude that's described here. And I certainly respect his opinion regarding what he states here. We're working within the budgets and the programs that we have available to us and doing the best we can under those circumstances.
He goes on to talk about this profile maintenance. And do I have your evidence correctly, Ms. Berardinucci, that your department is committed to this approach, a profile maintenance approach, as opposed to a profile control approach?
The profile maintenance approach is that's not the term that was used when I first started in the job when I sought advice from the inspector of dikes and the river engineering hydrologist. But the principle that was described at that time and that I have applied to the decisions I've been making is in keeping with that term or that description that he provided in this letter and his report.
Right, and he distincts that to profile control, which is removing more than what can be replaced over a short period of time. Is that your understanding as well?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I'm not clear on what was asked.
All right. Perhaps the easiest way to do this is to examine the actual report, which is Exhibit 1086. And I believe it's page 2. So there's two definitions and two terms that Dr. Church uses in this report. And you see the itemized number 1 and number 2 there? And so itemized number 1 is routine removal at convenient places along the river of a volume of sediment that over a period of years approximates the bed material. And he calls that profile maintenance. And then he goes and he draws the distinction between targeted removal of volumes of sediment in order to counteract the effects of local sediment accumulation with consequent rise of water levels immediately upstream. He calls that profile control. So does that help you now in terms of the distinction between profile control and profile maintenance?
Yes, I felt I was relatively clear on that. What I didn't understand was the question you were posing, so I'm sorry.
All right, so
yes.
But I guess what I'm after is do we have a commitment from the province that it's going to approach these gravel extraction applications on the basis of profile maintenance as opposed to profile control in the future?
As a statutory decision maker, what I can say is I've been applying the principle of profile maintenance to the decisions I've made to date.
Okay. In the confines of his report, he also makes some recommendations about the methodology for removal. And I think if you were to examine, I don't have my notes with me, but I think it's page 19. I'm hoping that's the case. It's either 19 or 20, Mr. Lund. Towards the bottom of the page, I think next to the last paragraph. Well, that does contain a provision I wanted to put to you. He's arguing for, you see in paragraph, at the bottom of the paragraph, or page 19, he says, hence the program must be both adaptive and precautionary. And he's talking about the assessment program. Do you agree with his comments there that whatever program is put into place must be both adaptive and precautionary?
Yes, I would agree.
Mr. Wang?
Well, I have to frame my response to that in that it would relate to DFO's mandate. So it's up to the province to determine what the flood mitigation program is. DFO's preference, as far as fish and fish habitat go, would be that it's as precautionary as possible, but we would defer to the province to determine what the appropriate flood mitigation activities would be.
Another place in his report, he talks about, from an environmental perspective, how scalping, in other words, taking off the top of the gravel bars, and it's not as preferable as what he calls pull back, in which you're taking from the edge of the gravel bars. Are you familiar with what he discusses in that context?
I'm familiar with his discussion in the report, yes.
And in terms of the applications that you examine, are you in favor of this pullback method, which, according to Dr. Church, results in less environmental degradation than a scalping methodology?
I don't favor one method over another. It's not my specialization to know.
But you certainly would be prepared to be guided by Dr. Church in terms of his advice. Is that fair to say?
I would be prepared to take advice from a number of qualified professionals, and I would turn to my own ministry staff who are advising me, as well as Dr. Church, and anyone else who could speak on that issue with the right qualifications.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I'm going to try and squeeze my questions in. I've been counting on Ms. Gärtner to go to some of the questions we had discussed about the membership. So I'll just very briefly go to the membership of the technical and both the management committee, which has already been shown to you as an exhibit, just to confirm that no First Nations or Indigenous there are no Indigenous members from, especially Indigenous peoples from the Gravel Reach, on either of those committees.
They are not, no, First Nations are not formally represented on either committee. However, we've been discussing that issue, and Emergency Management BC has been discussing that issue with First Nations for a number of years, certainly since they've become involved. There's a number of First Nations, and the challenge is how to be inclusive of everyone's point of view. To that end, I am aware that very recently I believe it's about 5 First Nations have created an association or entered into agreement to work together on gravel issues, which creates an opportunity for representation. In addition, the province, through its framework for consultation with First Nations, has reached out and referred to every First Nation that has claimed an interest in this area. And so actually I would suggest that our reach and communication and work with First Nation has been broader over the last few years than one might be able to afford through single representation of a single person on either committee. But at this point in time, we are open to trying to work further on that issue in the context of the longer term plan and a governance structure that works for that. So we're definitely open to the idea.
So there's room for improvement, so to say, or addition.
There's room for an alternative approach, certainly.
And just to be clear, the province has the responsibility regarding flood hazard assessment and management and flood risk management, right?
Yes, that is a provincial responsibility.
And you also accept the duty to consult, from what you're just speaking to, the duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples, right? Go ahead. I'll finish my sentence. Regarding impacts on the Aboriginal title and rights, including the right to fish, right?
That is a responsibility, yes.
And also, more specifically, you're also aware of impacts that, for example, flood mitigation measures can have on Indian reserve lands, right? And we've spoken to some other flood protection measures, such as dikes. If you have one area that has diking and another area that doesn't have diking, those flood mitigation measures can have a very much of a negative effect on the lands that don't have such protection, which is quite often Indian reserve lands.
That issue is taken into consideration when dike designs are provided to the province for review and approval.
But you are aware of the issue that if you have one area that has dike protection and another, such as an Indian reserve, that doesn't have dike protection, the dike can have a negative impact on those Indian reserve lands, for example.
I am absolutely aware of the issue of the potential for redirection or constraining water flow in one area, potentially damaging or eroding land in another area.
So that also makes the other option of gravel removal an even more important factor, and Indigenous interests very much have to be taken into account in that regard.
And so your question is?
Yeah, if you would agree with me that in that regard, when it comes to that, gravel removal becomes a very important aspect when it comes to flood protection measures in that context, that some areas have dike protections, others don't, right?
Even without that, it's an important consideration.
Now, when it comes to DFO, we've repeatedly heard that you're moving to co-management and joint decision-making with First Nations. Now, you'd agree with me that's the direction the department is moving in?
That's my understanding on a broad basis, but it's not specific at this time to issues related to fish habitat. I don't believe we have any particular initiative in that regard right now.
You don't have that in place yet when it comes to fish habitat management and taking into account Indigenous knowledge, etc., right?
There's no formal sort of co-management approach. The approach we're taking right now is to try to address that via the consultative mechanisms that will occur prior to any statutory decision taking place.
Okay. So you actually don't have, and to a great extent, there's still this aspect of Aboriginal title and rights also when it goes to conservation and habitat protection, right? That there's actually an Indigenous element, and I'm sure you'd agree with me that Indigenous knowledge can have very much a positive effect when it comes to habitat protection that should be taken into account.
Certainly, and I think the standard for the federal government is our doors open to that. We seek it as appropriate or as pertinent to any situation, and we're not exclusive in that regard.
But you haven't moved to that stage of actually joint decision-making or co-management when it comes to habitat protection and conservation issues?
Not on a broad basis. I think there may be a few exceptions. For example, I think, I'm really not familiar with the details, but up in Nisga'a territory, I think there are some things that are approaching that, but they're exceptions rather than norm.
So, but when we are now talking about sediment removal in the Lower Fraser, and the decision-making process is there, you're not at that stage where you actually have joint decision-making in place.
That's correct. We also don't have that shared with municipal governments or NGOs or others. DFO makes its decision singularly, even with regard to our provincial counterparts. We consider input and advice and positions, and where appropriate, rights, title, traditional use are typical considerations or input, as well as traditional knowledge from First Nations. But at this point, the decision-making is not joint, as I would classify it.
But again, we are talking about this interjurisdictional, quite interesting environment when it comes specifically to the issue that we're discussing here, which is gravel removal in the context of flood protection, habitat management, etc., right? So you're already at a stage where you are having to interact with one other jurisdiction, the federal and the provincial government respectively. So I'm suggesting to you that that would actually be a good field for joint decision-making actually being put into place between the federal, provincial government and First Nations.
Well, my perspective on that is the federal door is open to dialogue and discussion, but the sediment removal program is not particularly different in terms of opportunities and benefits from that kind of consultation and dialogue from virtually any other project that has the potential to affect fish habitat. So whether it's a mine development, somebody's condo on the Shuswap, or sediment removal, those issues are fairly common in terms of those kinds of benefits.
Sure, but when we are talking about moving towards joint decision-making, and you're acutely aware that there is Indigenous interests at play when it comes to those issues, there's obviously really that step has yet to be taken to actually enable full joint decision-making.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Thank you. Those are my questions in the limited time until now.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. So I think we're out of time for today, and I'll talk to my friends about some other options, and we can talk as well about your availability for another bit of time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the witnesses for attending today.
Well, they're finished for today, but they're going to be
They may be coming back.
Thank you very much.
Just in case.
Hearing is now adjourned for the day, and we'll resume at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.